DogWorks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dog Works. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com. You can support this podcast on patreon.com/Tiamaneke.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by First Paw Coffee Company, specializing in private label premium blend coffee. If you're serious about coffee, you should check it out. First Paw Coffee's passion is high-quality, small-batch roasted coffee. They take the extra time to taste and get everything perfect before they release new blends. They aim to bring you a cup of happiness each time you pour yourself some coffee. Find out more at ak.dog/free and enter for a chance to win some First Paw Coffee prizes, a book from our collection, and tote bag. One winner will be selected at random each month. That's ak.dog/free.
Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to Mushing Radio here on KVRF 89.7 in the Mat-Su Valley. RadioFreePalmer.org is our live streaming site, and you can hear all of our episodes over on DogWorksRadio.com. Be sure to check us out on social media by searching DogWorks Radio. And today is the start of our 2020 Iditarod coverage. I know my buddy Alex covered in for the last couple of days, but this is the official start since the race is underway, and he and I are together, and he's calling in from, I would assume, sunny California. Alex, how's it going today?
It's going great, Robert. I have been watching the live stream and looking at a bunch of interviews and looking at people's Twitter posts and people doing Facebook Lives, and it really looks like it's going to be an exciting and somewhat unusual race this year.
It does. And just staying on the weather for just a second, for folks that were watching the live stream there on Iditarod.com or here locally on some of the news channels, it has been snowing really, really hard since sometime early yesterday. We've gotten about probably close to 2 feet in the last couple of days. And I heard the commentator saying that it's snowing that way all the way to the Alaska range. So for the first third of the race, they're going to see a heck of a lot of brand new snow, aren't they?
They really are. And it was interesting watching the restart today because customarily it tends to be pretty cold up in Willow. It was a little bit warmer. I think it was in the mid to high 20s, but still below freezing. And it was consistently snowing. And it looked like it was snowing fairly hard during all of the starts. And normally, when they go across Willow Lake, when they first start, there's a chute, and it's maybe, 10 feet, 15 feet across, and the mushers will kind of go from side to side a little bit, and they'll go and they'll high five people who are looking on. But this year, because there was so much snow and it was so kind of packed in, everyone was sticking to this kind of rutted area in the middle, and there was no going from side to side, and there was no high-fiving the onlookers. So that was dramatically different from any Iditarod restart that I've seen.
That is true. And, they started up at the parking lot. Typically, they start right there on the lake. I would imagine with all this new snow that they couldn't get the lake plowed early enough to get all those dog trucks in. So they went down that little bit of a hill, and you saw a couple of real close near-miss crashes there as they took off out of the chute there in that rut you were talking about. But I watched about the second half of the mushers heading out from about 28 on, and all the teams look really good. All the mushers look really good. And I know that we have some stories to talk about. One really interesting story about Zoya Danur coming up in just a second. But Alex, what do you think so far? We've seen the ceremonial start. We've seen the restart. What are your thoughts moving forward here on our first official day of coverage of the 2020 Iditarod?
We've been talking for a couple years about this idea of the changing of the guards or the changing of the guard in Iditarod. And we've seen a lot of the really, really dominant racers from 5 or 6 years ago who are not as dominant anymore. And we've seen people like, for example, Martin Boozer, who is a four-time champion, who is this year running his kennel's puppy team so that his handler can run the A team, and he is pretty much, he is still a formidable dog man and a great competitor, but he's kind of taken himself out of that. Out of the running of people who could conceivably win the race. And at the same time, um, we've seen this group of mushers who, when I first started paying a lot of attention to Iditarod, uh, you know, 12 or 13 years ago, were like rookies or were very, very young mushers, and they have become dominant. And I'm talking about people like Pete Kaiser and Yor Ulsum and Nick Pettit and people like that. And so I think this year we're really going to see that kind of new guard of the Iditarod really taking over and really becoming dominant.
What I saw interesting when they were talking about it as they were starting is so many folks that ran the race, a decade and a half ago are back in the chute again. I know there were several people they were talking about that last ran the race in 2004, 2005, and they took all these years off, and here they are back. That's a real interesting strategy. And I say that because you and I have talked a lot on this show about the cycle of dogs. And, they have that sort of 5 or 6 or 7 year run as a really good sled dog. And then, of course, you have to breed up a brand new team to start over. But if you've taken off 10, 12, 14 years, you've cycled through a heck of a lot of dogs. And in some cases, these folks have even gotten out of dogs and then gotten back in and began to run the race again. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a very interesting thing, and I think that there are. I understand, although I have not, I have not raised my own dogs or had a kennel or even gone mushing more than a couple times, but um, I I understand that it's very much something that is seductive. It's very much something that is hard to completely get out of and stay out of. It reminds me of that line in The Godfather where someone says to Michael, "Well, Michael says they just keep pulling me back in, no matter how I try to get out."
Yeah, and I think that's a great line, and that really says a heck of a lot about the sport of dog mushing for sure. I'm reading some of the stories here, some of the headlines on Iditarod.com, and it seems like a lot of the mushers are really excited about the snow conditions, especially in this first third of the race. I know that has been sort of the talk of the town over the last couple of weeks. But for folks that train in conditions like this, and I'm thinking about Brent Sass in particular and some other folks that do very well in races like the Yukon Quest, they probably have a little bit of an advantage compared to folks that don't run in really deep snow or have to break trail. And I'm thinking about mushers possibly from the lower 48, even some of the mushers that are from Nome and other areas that don't receive snow like this. What are your thoughts on that moving forward?
Yeah, I think that's definitely going to be true. And also, I think that and Dallas Seavey was talking a little bit about this on KTUU, that there's going to be an advantage to mushers who have teams that are slower but can run more. So for a lot of teams that generally tend to run a little bit slower but have more stamina, they typically are at a huge disadvantage, especially early in the race when there are teams that can just go much, much faster. But because of the heavy snow, a lot of these, even the fastest teams, are going to be going a little bit more slowly than they ordinarily would. So I would think that some of the teams that are built more for stamina than for speed might have an advantage just trudging through so much snow.
So, Alex, let's talk a little bit about the coverage moving forward, in particular on Iditarod.com and more in particular with the Q pause thing. This is really their time to shine. I know they had a couple of smaller races to really get their feet wet this early this season when we talk about the race over in Norway, the race in Russia, and of course the John Bear Grease Marathon. But this one is the granddaddy of that championship. And you mentioned Dallas Seavey, and he is on the sidelines doing the color commentary for the QPause broadcasts and all that they're doing. For folks that have not listened to our show in months past where we've talked about this, what are your thoughts on that? I think this is really going to change how fans interact and watch the sport. Do you think so?
I do, and I'm happy to see Dallas Seavey back at Iditarod, even if it's just as a commentator. I imagine that he is even now plotting his return to Iditarod and plotting coming back maybe next year, maybe the year after that. It's exciting to have someone like him as a commentator. It's also exciting to see how they're going to cover this in a way that will differentiate it from a lot of the more traditional coverage. The traditional coverage we've seen on Alaska TV stations, ADN, and Alaska Public Radio, and those type of outlets all have their own style of covering it. And my impression, anyway, is that they want to bring a little bit more of a faster pace and a little bit more style. And I'm not exactly sure how that's going to play out, but it will be very interesting to see if they are able to really come up with a way of covering the race that is different from how everybody else covers the race.
One thing that I think that they're really going to do is provide a lot of data. And I know that they're doing that on the website. They're going to provide, people are data driven these days. And you and I have compared this sport a lot to other sports, in particular the National Football League and that sort of thing. And I have to admit, Alex, this afternoon before the restart and before Michelle and I went out to start doing our shoveling of the snow apocalypse, we watched a NASCAR race, and it was my first NASCAR race on TV in many, many years. And the first thing I thought about that was all of the data that they were providing on NASCAR, where the standings are and how fast teams are going and, different camera angles and all of that. I think that that's sort of the model that they're trying to do with the QPause data in particular on their website. You think so?
Yeah, and I noticed that for people who subscribe to the tracker looks very different this year than it did before, and there is just a lot more data that you can get almost immediately when you pull up the tracker. For example, the leaderboard not only tells you the name and the bib number, which is usually what it does, but it tells you exactly where, just looking on the leaderboard, not looking on the tracker itself, tells you exactly where each team is, what their current speed is, how many miles they have to go to get to Nome, how much rest they've had during this run. And so that's there's a lot of stuff that's just right there. And then of course when you click on it, there's even more material that's available as well. So I don't know that anyone has really figured out a way to harness all of this data yet, but it is definitely true that there is a lot more data that is just readily available than there has been in past years.
So let's talk a little bit about that. You talked about the trackers. I know that you typically subscribe to the Insider, so you can get that tracker data as well as all the interviews and the stories. And I typically don't. I usually get my information from news reports and that sort of thing. So for folks that may be brand new to this may be their first Iditarod as a fan, and maybe the first time that they've ever listened to our show. What should people be looking for when they're trying to follow this race as a fan, in particular if they do have a a insider subscription, because you often hear on social media that they are just hitting that refresh button fanatically 24 hours a day. They're just sitting there at the computer, refresh, 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 refresh. That's not the most conducive way to follow the race, but as a seasoned veteran of the Insider and as an Iditarod fan, how should folks follow this race if they do have that option?
I think the very first thing that they should do is to recognize that as great as the trackers are, they are fallible, and sometimes they don't ping for a while. So it's important when you're looking at the tracker not to obsess about where this particular dot is and why it's not moving, but also to look at when was the last time that it refreshed, because we see every single year that almost every team will go through parts of the trail where their tracker just won't update, sometimes for an hour or more. And that can be upsetting and a little bit frightening when you're watching and when you're trying to figure out what's going on. The other thing to keep in mind is that the trackers also have an SOS button. So if a musher or if a team is in dire consequences, they can always press this button and get help. Now, if they do that, they are disqualified from the race. So that's not something that people do lightly, but keep in mind that even when they are out in the middle of nowhere, they do have the ability to summon help. And the other thing is that it's going to be really important as we get further into the race to keep in mind that there are mandatory rests. So everyone has to take a mandatory 24-hour rest at some checkpoint along the trail. They have to take an 8-hour rest somewhere on the Yukon River. And then there's a mandatory 8-hour rest for everyone at the White Mountain checkpoint, which is about 77 miles from Nome. So teams that are a little bit further along but have not yet taken their 24, you have to factor in that when they stop to take their 24, they're going to not be moving at all for 24 hours, plus usually a little bit more time to take into account the different starting times. So they'll be doing 24 hours plus of sitting there while everyone else is moving down the trail.
So people also need to keep in mind that this is a 24-hour race. This goes on 24 hours a day, and folks often don't recognize that. They think, oh, well, I'll turn the tracker on when I get up in the morning and see where the standings are. But a heck of a lot of things happen overnight, and from a musher's perspective, that's the best time to run dogs, especially if it's warmer on the trail, if it's 20 degrees or above. I always like to run at night. That's when I find my best time on the trail, and a heck of a lot of action can happen at 2 or 3 in the morning, can't it?
It really can, and that's a very important point that you just made, is that for humans, it's much more difficult to be out when it's cold and when it's windy. And if it's 20 degrees above or 20 degrees below, that can be very difficult, especially when it's 20 or 30 below for humans. But these dogs run best when it's colder. These dogs are not really built for running when it's 40 degrees above zero. They're built for running when it's, between 10 and 30 degrees below zero. I think that's when they're really at their best.
Yeah, they usually rock and roll, like you said, about 10 below to 10 above is prime running time for a sled dog. And I think we're going to see some cold temperatures out there for folks that follow the show. You will know that for about a week and a half, I was on the Serum Run expedition, and I had to pull out because my machine broke down, my snow machine. So I'm saddened that I'm not out there, but I am here to do this very cool podcast with you. But yeah, they're going to see some cold temperatures. They're going to see a heck of a lot of deep snow, maybe even a lot of overflow, which isn't a real big deal for dog teams compared to snow machiners. But I think those three things will be the big story of the race, don't you think?
Absolutely. And I think that because of those three things, we're going to, I think that we could really see a result that is very, very different. And I think that we could really see some racers who have, and some teams who have not done as well in the past few years really make huge jumps.
Alex, one of the things that we do every night on this show is our musher profile of the day, where we dive deep into one particular musher. Typically, it's one of the lesser known folks, the middle to the back of the packers, one of those folks that doesn't have that name recognition that we typically know of. But today, since this is only day one, we're not going to talk about that today, but we have a couple of really interesting stories that developed in the last 48 to 72 hours from now, and one that developed pretty much right at the starting line, which we're going to talk about second. But the first one I would like for you to talk about, and that is Jeff King. He was at an event for another podcast. They were doing a live event at the Beartooth Theater, and he felt he didn't feel quite right, and he ended up having to go to the hospital and take it from there.
Yeah, so I talked about this a few nights ago, but just to recap, we had afterwards he was feeling a little bit ill, and he thought maybe it was something that he ate, but it didn't really get better, and he was convinced that he should go and get it checked out. And it's a good thing that he did, because it turned out that he needed emergency surgery, and I believe that he said that it was intestinal surgery and also a hernia. And the doctors had told him that it was the condition was so bad that if he had waited like another 48 hours, he would have developed sepsis and could have died from this. So that's a very, very serious thing. Luckily, he was in Anchorage. He was very close to where he could get extremely good medical care, and got emergency surgery that night. And his handler, Sean Underwood, who had completed his Iditarod qualifiers and was planning to run Iditarod in 2021, was able to step in and is running Jeff's dogs, on 4 days' notice.
And they made a emergency exception for that. They approved him. The qualifying board approved Sean to run the race in Jeff's place. Of course, he did finish the qualifiers this year, but there was a lot of talk on social media about he didn't meet the qualifications that all the other rookies had to do. In particular, the rookie meeting, which is a couple of day long meeting in early December. And a lot of people are upset about that. What are your thoughts?
I understand why people are upset about this, but one of the things that I like about the way that Iditarod is generally run is that there is a lot of common sense that goes into how the rules are applied. So while I understand that some people are upset that he didn't do some of these things that the other rookies did, this is also an emergency, and this is not something that they clearly would do with every rookie, nor should they, but that if this is the choice of having someone like him who is very familiar with the dogs and has worked with these dogs and trained these dogs for months and months and months, can just step in and be able to let these dogs run. And ultimately, for me, it comes down to, we talk a lot about how, and everyone talks a lot about in Iditarod, how it's all about the dogs. But this is really a great example of how this is serving the dogs. And it would not be fair to these dogs, these great athletes, to penalize them because Jeff King had an emergency medical condition and wasn't able to run.
I agree with you, and I know that Sean has been working with Jeff and his kennel for several years. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's been 6 years. So he has a heck of a lot of experience, and he has done his qualifiers. But again, we've talked a lot about this on the show about, is a person really ready if they've just completed their qualifiers, and that's been subject for debate for many years. Is 750 miles enough? Is a couple of years on the runners enough? So on and so forth. So I think we'll see him do pretty well on the trail. I don't think he's going to be a barn burner. I don't think he's going to be in the top 10, but running with that short of notice, I think he will have some challenges, but I think he'll do very well. The other story is even more interesting, and that is about Zoya Denur. She was scheduled to run in the Iditarod, and everything looked good. I follow her on Facebook, and she was excited to be down here in Anchorage and ready for the start. But right before the start, it is my understanding that she had some health issues, and she pulled out at the very last minute. I mean, at the proverbial 12th hour. She pulled out right before they jumped on the runners, and her husband, John Schandelmeyer, took over and is heading towards Nome. And for folks that don't know anything about John, he is the prototypical Alaskan. He has done Iditarods and quests for many years, but he hasn't done them for the last few years. He's a hunter and a trapper and a homesteader, and he is if you were to make a poster of an Alaskan, he would probably fit the bill. But what do you think about that? At the last moment, right before you literally pull the hook, somebody jumps in and takes your place.
Now, this is something that I really don't understand, and I would love to have been privy to the conversations about this, because when he stepped up, the commentators were shocked to see him. So, as you said, this is something that was literally at the very last moment, and I would assume that this was approved by someone. But as we were getting ready to record this, the Iditarod still hadn't released any kind of official statement about it. So it's very intriguing to me, and it really literally happened at the last second. So I don't quite know what is going on. Obviously we hope that Zoya is okay, and that whatever she is dealing with is something that is not, serious or life-threatening. But it is, I've never heard of anyone being substituted this late. I've never even heard of anyone being seeing Sean Underwood being substituted 4 days before seemed really very surprising and a little bit shocking. But seeing someone on the morning, with however many minutes of notice that this was happening is unheard of.
It is. And you and I were talking right before the show about what's going to happen on the trail. He's a pretty big guy, and she's a pretty small woman. Obviously, her substitute clothing is not going to fit. I doubt that he wears size small gloves and different boots and hats and all of that. That could turn into something real interesting, couldn't it?
It really could, and I would have to imagine that, as with Sean 4 days ago, that there are in their circle of friends and in their kennel, that there are emergency preparations to send out at least some gear and some clothing to some of these checkpoints where he's going to need them.
I think that this is really going to be one of the stories of the race, especially in the first few days. And I'm sure by the time we jump on the air tomorrow that we're going to have a lot more information about that particular story and how that developed. And I'm really excited to see that. Alex, we have just a couple of minutes. What else do you have on the plate before we end tonight's show?
So I'm going to put you on the spot, because you frequently put me on the spot with this, and ask for your predictions. But I'll give you a second to think about it, because I'll give you my predictions. As longtime listeners know, every year I predict that Ali Zirkle is going to win the Iditarod. This year, I am not predicting that, but I do think that she will have a top 5 finish. My prediction this year is that Jessie Royer is going to win the Iditarod. And rounding out the top 5, although I'm not sure what order, is Ali Zirkle, Nick Pettit, Yor Olsum, and Pete Kaiser.
Wow, that's pretty close to mine. I would probably say my top musher this year would probably be either Pete Kaiser or Brent Sass. And I say Brent Sass because he just finished and won the Yukon Quest on a trail very similar to at least the first half of this race. So I think he is trained up for this probably the best. And I think coming off that Quest win, he has a heck of a lot to do very well with that. Nick Pettit, I believe, is up there. As I said, Pete Kaiser. And fourth, let's see, who would I think as somebody in fourth? Maybe Wade Mars. I usually pick him in that top 4 or 5. And then I would have to say somebody like Travis Beals or maybe even Lance Mackey. I don't know. Let's call him the dark horse. You never know what's going to happen with Lance. I know he had run the Ronde just last weekend and he didn't do very well, but he says he's out to have something to prove. So you never can discount Lance for sure. And for Rookie of the Year, I'm going to have to go with I don't know. Who is your Rookie of the Year? Then I'll give mine.
I hadn't picked a Rookie of the Year. I was hoping that you would have done that. So I don't have one.
We'll figure it out. But right now, what's that, Michelle?
Jessica, she ran with Nicole.
Oh, yeah. Maybe Jessica Klika, I believe is how you say her name. She could do very well. I know she's not a rookie, but I hope to see her do something good on the trail as well. Alex, so we are just about out of time. What we're going to do, folks that are listening, please hit that subscribe button and you will get all of these episodes right in your inbox wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it be on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, wherever, or you can always get them at dogworksradio.com. But typically we do our shows every night around the same time. We're going to go for 7 o'clock Alaska time. That will be 11 o'clock Eastern. So stay up late and listen to the show because remember, this is a 24-hour race. Anything else in closing, Alex?
Just that I am usually during Iditarod up very, very late, keeping track of things and watching the tracker. So if you are up, hit me up on Twitter at Coldfoot Films. And I'm at Robert Forto. That's Forto on Twitter. And you can always follow us on social media by searching Dogworks Radio. Alex, it's fun to be back with you. I think this is our 9th or 10th year together. So I'm always looking forward to this. It's definitely the highlight of our podcast year for sure. We'll talk again soon. Okay. All right. Thanks, Robert. Thank you. On behalf of my co-host, Alex Stein, this is Robert Forto for Mushing Radio. We'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by First Paw Coffee Company. Learn more at firstpaw.coffee.
From Dogworks Radio, this is Mushing Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Alex Stein and Robert Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto, created for Dogworks Radio. Did you know that Alaska Dogworks trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dogworks on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.